Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Scott Van Laer, Director of the Paul Smith College Vic. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming out this afternoon. I see the rain brought everybody in. Brad brought everybody in. This lecture series, the Adirondack Lecture Series, is sponsored by the Adirondack Council, as well as the college's sustainability program. Just a couple housekeeping measures before we get started. If you could silence your cell phones, please. Appreciate everybody having a mask on. I know that's the most comfortable thing. We do have complimentary beverages outside. Help yourself to that. So I know it's not appropriate to say that you were really looking forward to one particular speaker, so I won't say that. But I will say why I was really looking forward to this one today. I grew up in the Adirondacks, and not here, not in the tourist part. So I had a very, I heard certain things about the APA. We didn't have an anti-APA sign on the side of our barn or anything. I washed dishes as a young kid in an area at a hotel, and I would hear the crowd talk about, well, it wasn't about Bob Lennon, but it may well have been about Bob Lennon. So I would hear all those conversations, and then eventually I became a forest ranger and started working in the Adirondacks myself, and just having a better understanding of what the APA did and accomplished. So I had a very, two different perspectives on it, I guess. And then the last 17, 18 years, I've been spending most Friday nights, Friday evenings, listening to Bob Lennon and other folks from the APA, from the good old days or bad old days. Hear stories about the Petty brothers, Greenleaf Chase, Peter Payne. So when this book came out, it was great background for all those stories I had. So with that, let me turn this over to Brad Edmondson.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott. It's an honor to be here. I've attended many lectures in this space, and it's really a thrill to be the guy behind the podium. Thanks very much to you all for coming. So this is a little bit of an intimidating crowd for me because a lot of you lived through this stuff. I can see, there's several people I interviewed in the audience, and a lot of people who I think are intimately familiar with the story. And bear with me if you know this already, or if you have a different interpretation of something that I say. I really encourage you to raise your hand at the end and challenge it, or come up to me afterwards and tell me what you think. But I do see a couple of younger faces, and also I assume there's some people who didn't live through it, so I'm going to assume that you're curious about the subject, but you don't know very much. And please bear with me if I start covering familiar ground here. But I wrote this book because we felt that it was important to commemorate something that happened 50 years ago. And what happened 50 years ago was a state law that created the Adirondack Park Agency and ordered it to write two land use plans. One for the state-owned land in the park and one for the privately owned land. So these plans became law in 1972 and 1973, and they were, I believe, just as important to the Adirondacks as was the creation of the park and the Forever Wild Clause in the 1890s. And I'm going to explain why the APA was so important and how it came to pass. So the work that produced this book began actually 19 years ago when I started doing oral history interviews with people who had set up the APA. I ended up talking to about 60 people and making about 2,000 pages of transcripts from these interviews. And the interviews are being used in a documentary film that'll be shown on Mountain Lake PBS on October 25th. And also excerpts from these interviews will be served up in an online exhibit that will go up on the Adirondack Experience website right around the same time as the movie airs. I'm going to show a preview of the documentary after I finish the talk. So here we go. You could say, really, that this is a story about a map. And this is the map that portrays the area that we're sitting in now. Here's Paul Smith's College. I believe this is Saranac Lake here. Lake Placid, Sable Forks, and the northern Adirondacks. Every color on this map corresponds to a different set of rules about what you can and cannot do on the land. Now, I come from a newspaper and magazine background, and an editor I once worked for referred to land use planning as a MEGO topic. That's M-E-G-O, and that stands for My Eyes Glaze Over. It's considered pretty boring, and this could be really boring if I presented it a certain way. But this story is really full of drama, and it's full of drama for two reasons. One is that this plan was really a pretty wild idea when it was adopted. The idea of controlling environmental impact was fairly new in the early 70s, and the plan was revolutionary because nobody had ever tried it on a piece of territory this big. It's worth reminding you, even if you know it already, that the Adirondack Park is roughly the same size as the state of Vermont, and that most of the Adirondack Park, for those of you who are new to the Adirondacks, most of the Adirondack Park is privately owned land. So it's an enormous piece of territory, and most of it is privately owned. And the second reason for the drama in this story is that the private land plan, the plan for the use of the private land in the park, was a huge imposition of state power onto a rural area. And most of the local people didn't like it one bit when the law went into effect in 1973. The local people felt that they weren't being listened to, so they reacted in the only way they could, with protests that became increasingly nasty, with death threats and violence. So the big idea behind the wild idea is the Forever Wild Clause, and you probably all know what the Forever Wild Clause is, but you might not know how unusual the Forever Wild Clause is. It's an article of the New York State Constitution that makes it illegal to cut a single tree on state-owned land in the Forest Preserve, the Adirondack Forest Preserve, without passing a statewide referendum that takes 2 years to set up. It's an extreme level of land protection. And from the moment voters passed it into the Constitution in 1894, there have always been people who are willing to go to court and challenge any deviation from that very strict standard. Even the smallest proposed changes to the Adirondack Forest Preserve have been struck down in court because the Forever Wild Clause uses very specific language. And the thing is that before the APA came along, the vision behind the Forever Wild Clause wasn't really being protected. So you might say that what happened 50 years ago was a kind of a contradiction. The Adirondacks took on detailed rules and regulations. The place that's forever wild became a park. So back in 2002, the very first person I interviewed was Clarence Petty. Here he is shown in 1973 at the age of 68. He died in 2009 at the age of 104. So I want to show of hands. How many of you have heard of Clarence Petty? How many of you have met Clarence Petty? Still quite a few. All the APA alums, of course, have met Clarence Petty. But most of you have heard of Clarence, and that's because Clarence is really, he's been gone for 11 years now. But he's an extremely useful device for a historian because his life is a through line of 20th century Adirondack history. He was born in 1905. His first home was a cabin that his father built illegally on state land in Upper Saranac Lake. And it was common back then, to build illegally on state land. They moved to a legal home 2 miles away when Clarence was still, before he enrolled in school, and Clarence owned that house for the rest of his life. That home is now owned by the Nature Conservancy. So you might have either told your kids, or been told as a child, that kids today have it really easy. We used to have to walk to school in the snow. Clarence and his brother actually did have to walk to school in the snow. It was 18 miles one way from their home in Corries to the school in Saranac Lake. They walked over on Sunday, and they walked back on Friday, and because they had chores to do on Saturday, and they walked wearing snowshoes, and they didn't care what the weather was doing, and that's just the way it was back in the 1910s in the Adirondacks. Clarence was a state forest ranger, of course, but in his heart, he never changed. He was really always an Adirondack kid who loved to explore the backcountry. And in 1959, Clarence got a dream assignment because a legislative committee in New York wanted to know how much state land in the Adirondacks would meet a legal definition of the word wilderness. So this committee hired Clarence and a partner to find out the answer, and those two men spent 3 years flying and walking over every acre of the forest preserve. This is one of the maps that they used when they were walking through the forest preserve between 1959 and 1961. I don't know if you can see it or not, but this is a map of the Indian Lake area, and this little red handwriting here and here says proposed wilderness area. And then there are marks on the map based on their travels about where the land ceases to qualify as wilderness anymore. So Clarence and his partner Neil Stout were looking for places that were at least a half a mile away from any legal road and contained no buildings. And in 1961 they reported that about 1 million acres of the Adirondack Park would qualify as wilderness if the state removed just a few roads and cabins. They also found that the forest preserve was not in very good shape when they inspected it. They documented over 100 miles of illegal roads right around 1960, dozens of illegal cabins, each with their own garbage dump. And in one memorable case, Neil Stout told me about an outhouse that hunters had built over a stream that drained into a village's water supply. So the state conservation department was supposed to be preventing things like this, and clearly they were not doing their job. In the early 1960s, there were citizens groups that were starting to put pressure on legislators to do more to protect the Adirondacks. There was the Adirondack Mountain Club for hikers, there was the Conservation Council for hunters, and there were a few bird watchers and romantics who thought that wild nature should be protected for its own sake. And Clarence Petty belonged to this group, but it was a fringe group, and it didn't have very much clout at all. So I interviewed about 6 dozen people for this story, and again, the thing that came up was how much of the story turns on personal relationships. Clarence and Neil Stout reported their findings. Clarence is on the left, Neil's in the middle. They reported their findings to the guy who's holding out his plate, Assemblyman Watson Pomeroy. He was chair of the state legislative committee that had sent these 2 men out to map the forest preserve. And Clarence turned Assemblyman Pomeroy into a forever wilder by taking him on camping trips like the one pictured here. Clarence told me that Pomeroy had been on the swim team at Yale, and he loved to swim in Adirondack lakes and ponds. And Clarence told me that what they would do is they would go out on these weekend hiking trips, and they'd come across a pond. He remembered one in particular called Grizzle Ocean in the Faro Lakes Wilderness. And Pomeroy would be at the shore of the pond, and he would strip off all of his clothes and hand them to Clarence Petty, who would walk around the edge of the pond as Pomeroy swam across it, and then Pomeroy would climb out, and Clarence would hand him his clothes, and they'd continue hiking. And it worked. By the time Watson Pomeroy had swum through a couple dozen ponds, he was the fiercest defender of the forever wild forest preserve you ever saw. And that relationship brought wilderness protection much closer to the mainstream of state politics. Here's another relationship that was really important. The governor of New York on the right, Nelson Rockefeller, and his best friend, his younger brother, Lawrence Rockefeller, in the middle, are shown here on an overnight camping trip that they took in the High Peaks in 1965. The guy on the left, as some of you already know, is Clarence Petty's older brother, Bill, who was also a state forest ranger. Bill was the other guy who snowshoed 18 miles one way in the snow to go to school. Now, Rockefeller, of course, was probably the most powerful governor in the history of the state of New York. And he was the leader in the early 60s of a very small group of white men who had enormous power, and their power was further enhanced by the fact that they were very rarely challenged. People used to call this group the establishment. If you remember the 60s and 70s, you remember the establishment. Well, Nelson Rockefeller was a leader of the establishment, and his brother Lawrence was definitely one of the senior members of the establishment, but Lawrence was not an elected official. He was a businessman turned philanthropist whose passion was making big parks for the public to enjoy. It's something that's not widely known, but Rockefeller money played a direct role in creating at least 6 national parks in the United States. And Lawrence Rockefeller, more than anyone else, I think, is responsible for pushing the federal government into the business of buying and protecting open space. So Nelson was really fond of his younger brother. They had been playmates on the family's estate, and they loved to dress up as cowboys and play around. This is a picture of Nelson on the right and Lawrence on the left when they took a family trip to Western National Parks in the mid-1920s in their finest cowboy outfits. So every week when their schedules permitted it as adults, Nelson and Lawrence would go to a private barber shop together to get their hair trimmed at the same time. So they were really tight. And by 1967, Nelson had been governor of New York for 8 years. Everybody he met, everybody he knew wanted something from him. So Lawrence was an extremely important person in his life because with Lawrence the relationship went far deeper than that. But as it turned out, Lawrence wanted something from him too. Lawrence had a private think tank, as you would if you were a Rockefeller brother. And in the summer of 1967, without really telling anybody about it first, Lawrence released a proposal to turn the core of the Adirondacks, the High Peaks and the Central Adirondacks, into a national park. So this outer line is the boundary of the Adirondack Park. The inner line is what Lawrence wanted to turn into a national park. So you see there's Indian Lake here we are up around here, and goes all the way over to, I think that might be Cranberry Lake. So the prettiest parts of the Adirondacks, the core of the Adirondacks, would become a national park. And consensus is a very hard thing to generate in New York State politics. But in this case, this proposal generated instant consensus. Everybody hated this proposal. Everybody. Because for one thing, the proposal left most of the Adirondack Park out. And it really didn't touch on what was the state going to do with the donut once the federal government got the whole. Hunting is usually not allowed in national parks, so all the hunters were upset. There's about 600,000 acres of private land on the proposed national park. The private landowners didn't want to sell their land or have it claimed by eminent domain. And then, even people who didn't have a direct stake in the fight were kind of insulted by the proposal. They felt, this is New York's park. We're proud of it, and we're perfectly capable of doing a good job with this park ourselves. So buzz off, Lawrence. And Lawrence shrewdly he gave one speech defending the proposal. And he also privately told his brother, well, if that's how New Yorkers feel about it, then they should take better care of their park because the park is facing big problems. And he backed away. So Nelson knew immediately that this proposal was toxic, but he loved his brother, and he noticed that a lot of people were sort of agreeing with Lawrence Rockefeller that the Adirondacks was at a turning point and that something needed to be done to protect the park. In 1967, the Adirondack Park had problems. It had all of the overcrowding and misuse issues that Clarence Petty and Neil Stout had documented in the early 1960s. Nothing had been done about those problems. And there was also a much bigger problem that had come up in the mid-1960s, which was vacation homes. This is something that I actually found on eBay and donated to the Adirondack Museum years ago. It is an artist's sketch of a development that was going to go in north of Tupper Lake called Tom DeLay. And what was happening in the mid-1960s was big corporations were buying up big tracts of rural land in the United States and carving them into home lots and selling the home lots individually to people from middle-class families who had a lot more disposable income in the early and mid-1960s and were dreaming of a vacation home. And so this had a really profound effect on certain towns in southern Vermont. It had happened on the west coast of Florida. It had happened in the Southwest. And there were sort of rumblings and intimations that it was going to happen in the Adirondacks. And in fact, this is an architect's rendering of what one such development would have looked like just north of Tupper Lake. It was going to have either 4,000 to 7,000 home sites on 18,000 acres. It was going to have, everything was very rustic-y and woody looking. There were going to be there was going to be an equestrian center. There was going to be a sailing lake. It was just, the pictures looked really beautiful. Tanya and I, my wife Tanya and I went there about a year ago to inspect the property, and it's actually Spring Pond Walk, if you've ever been there. It's a beautiful wetland, but it's a wetland, it's a swamp. And if this had actually been built 50 years ago, those buildings would be nasty. So anyway, it was facing a big problem. So Nelson did what a lot of politicians do when he's facing a big thorny problem. He appointed a commission to study it and make recommendations. This is usually a way for a politician to sidestep an issue and sweep it under the rug. But that is not what Nelson Rockefeller was like. Nelson Rockefeller liked to portray himself to voters as a builder and a problem solver. He liked to pour concrete. As you all know, he tore down 98 acres of downtown Albany and evicted thousands of residents from that neighborhood to build a new state capitol complex, which he's very happy to see it going up in this photograph. And another thing he really liked was he liked to get really smart people together and to give them a knotty problem and have them come up with big, bold, cutting-edge ideas, solutions. So what he did was he got 11 members of the establishment together, and he formed the Temporary Study Commission for the Future of the Adirondacks. And he asked them to recommend how to solve the park's problems. And when he convened the Temporary Study Commission in the fall of 1968, an interstate highway had just opened that ran up the east side of the park from Albany to Montreal, the Northway. Of course, we all know the Northway. Well, Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to remake the Adirondacks in the spirit of the Northway, the spirit of interstate highway travel. People loved to get to recreation centers in their cars in the 1960s. In the 60s, national parks were all about getting to the scenic area in your car. There were parkways, there were motor campgrounds, there were hotels, there were beaches, there were snack bars, and the Forever Wild Clause was in the way of this vision of the Adirondacks. And Lawrence Rockefeller, frankly, wanted to get rid of the Forever Wild Clause so that he could develop the Adirondacks in national park style. And through his influence, he put several members on the Temporary Study Commission who agreed with this vision. So these are the commissioners and some of the staff of the Temporary Study Commission. Lawrence Rockefeller is not in this picture, but several people who worked for him were. This is Henry Diamond. This, I believe, is the chairman of the commission, Leo O'Brien, who was a former Albany congressman who helped Lawrence establish Virgin Islands National Park. And there's several other Lawrence Rockefeller acolytes scattered around. He made sure that their views were represented. But the governor also put several strong defenders of the Forever Wild Clause on the commission. And the most important of them were these two guys, these two younger guys, right up here. Harold Jerry and George Davis. This, by the way, is Peter Payne in 1968. He was on the Temporary Study Commission, too. So Harold Jerry and George Davis were very, very central to the story. Jerry was just an employee. He was not a voting member of the commission, but he was a hardcore Forever Wild advocate. He wanted no buildings at all in the backcountry of the Adirondacks. And he made sure that the people he hired, the staff of the Temporary Study Commission, agreed with him. The first person he hired was Clarence Petty, because Clarence knew the park better than anybody else, and he had compiled all that data from the Forest Preserve. The second person he hired was this young guy, George Davis, who was a retired U.S. Forest Ranger who had just enrolled in graduate school at Cornell University. George wanted to study how to preserve natural ecosystems in the Adirondacks while also allowing people to work and play there. He wanted to apply a new concept, and the concept was called carrying capacity. The idea was to use data on soils, slopes, wildlife, wetlands, other factors, to use all of this data to rate the ability of a given place to handle development without degrading the area around it. And that was kind of an exact match for the job that Harold Jerry needed to fill. So Jerry hired Davis and became his mentor. He introduced, this is Jerry on the left, Davis on the right, on a camping trip. Jerry introduced Davis to Clarence Petty and said, "Get out of the office and don't come back." George and Clarence spent the next year, 1968-69, hiking near the Forest Preserve, hiking again over the areas that Clarence had just gone over 6 years earlier, and Harold Jerry went with them whenever he could. George and Clarence and Jerry were 3 of about 15 staff members who did an amazing amount of research in 14 months. They turned in 800 pages of reports on land, wildlife, transportation, the economy, and more. And these technical reports of the Temporary Study Commission are pretty obscure, they're pretty hard to find. But if you can find them, they're worth reading still 50 years later. All that research went to the commissioners. And the commissioner's job was to make recommendations, because they were the smart guys. But the first the two factions, the Forever Wild people and the Lawrence Rockefeller people, they had to have a private ballot to see which vision of the Adirondacks was going to win. After a year, the Forever Wilders won. They elected a new chairman. They replaced Leo O'Brien, who was a Lawrence Rockefeller man, with a new chairman who did a masterful job of turning a very bold set of recommendations into law. So how did he do that? He did it with relationships. Again, it was relationships that allowed the new chairman to do it. The new chairman, of course, was Harold Hochschild, who was a wealthy, retired mining executive who loved the Adirondacks so much that he spent every day that was possible at his family's camp on Blue Mountain Lake, his family's estate. It's sort of called a Camp Coyley, but it actually was a complex of buildings, including a mansion. And he even founded and endowed the Adirondack Museum in Blue Mountain Lake. So needless to say, Harold Hochschild thought the Forever Wild Clause was sacred. And Hochschild had a secret weapon. He had a very close relationship with the New York Times. His main contact there was the editorial page editor, John Oakes, who was also a true blue defender of the Forever Wild Clause in Adirondack Wilderness. Hochschild knew that the Times would endorse recommendations to ensure that the Adirondacks remained a 6 million acre wilderness and open space park. And so the commission did release those recommendations at the beginning of 1973, and really, its timing could not have been better. This is the front page, or no, I'll get to that. If you're in your mid-60s or older, you might remember the first Earth Day in 1970. I was 11 years old. You remember this urgent sense of anxiety that was sweeping over the country. People had suddenly come to believe that the planet was in danger of being suffocated by pollution and overcrowding. And it was really a pressing concern. New York City was the epicenter of this movement. And if you needed city voters to get reelected in November 1970, as Nelson Rockefeller did, you needed strong pro-environment positions. And this was a fairly new issue. And politicians didn't really know what to do in many cases. Nelson Rockefeller celebrated Earth Day by riding a bicycle, a non-polluting vehicle, he called it. He rode a bicycle in Albany for the press, and you'll notice if you're looking carefully that he's going the wrong way on a one-way street, which is a really nice touch. That's what journalists do. We add those really nice touches. So he needed good press, he needed strong environmental creds, and he really needed the endorsement of the New York Times. So Harold Hochschild used the Times as both a carrot and a stick. He threatened politicians who might not vote with him, and he rewarded others, like Governor Rockefeller, who backed him up. He kept John Oakes informed about the Temporary Study Commission as it was doing its work. Rockefeller knew that Oakes knew, and that was all it took. And yes, the Times did endorse Rockefeller for re-election in 1970, and he was re-elected by a wide margin. Shortly after he was re-elected, the Commission's recommendations were released on January 3rd, 1971. And you can see this is the front page of the New York Times on Sunday, January 3rd. The Sunday Times was by far had the biggest readership. This is a picture of an Adirondack lake. Here's the story by Barrett Webster, summarizing the Temporary Study Commission's recommendations. If you're a newspaper person, you know, an older newspaper person, you know that left side above the fold front page is the most important story in the newspaper. So this is left side above the fold front page in the most important newspaper in New York, one of the most important newspapers in the United States. This is the prime real estate of journalism, is where the Temporary Study Commission got its story placed. This is their report. They released 181 extremely ambitious recommendations, and the recommendations were ranked so that recommendation number 1 was the most important. And this recommendation called for a new state agency that would write the 2 big master plans. And this was indeed a wild idea. One reason was land use decisions are usually left to local governments, to towns and localities. There's another clause in the New York State Constitution that's often called home rule, which means that certain powers that are not done by the state are reserved for the towns and localities. And zoning was almost always one of those powers covered under home rule. But this was, so it was a big deal to ignore home rule and say that the state should basically zone 6 million acres of northern New York. The second reason it was a wild idea was the scope. 6 million acres. The public lands were as much acreage as Yellowstone National Park. The private lands were as much acreage as the state of Connecticut. Nobody had ever attempted to do a regional land use plan that big before. The report also made recommendations that were decades ahead of their time. It introduced, for example, the idea of conservation easements, and it outlined a plan to use them to protect working forests and farmlands from turning into residential developments. And it took the state of New York 25 years to pick up on this recommendation under Governor George Pataki, who famously campaigned to save 1 million acres of the Adirondacks. Today, 1/3 of the private land in the Adirondacks is protected by easements. So Harold Jerry and his crew were extremely farsighted. And the governor really wanted the Adirondack Park Agency to pass. He was really lucky. He introduced the bill on April 1971, just before the second Earth Day. And some of you will remember this commercial that dropped on Earth Day 1971.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can start it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
So two things about that commercial. One is the actor is Sicilian. His name is Oscar Corti. He had a long career as a Hollywood character actor playing Native Americans under the stage name Iron Eyes Cody, but he is a Sicilian man named Oscar Corti. The second thing about that commercial is that the group that paid for that commercial to be made, Keep America Beautiful, which is still around and is an anti-litter group, it's funded by the paper industry. Because they had just come out with paper cups and paper plates and disposable paper food wrappers that people were throwing out their windows. So the industry that in a way created the problem was put the commercial out there to attempt to ameliorate the problem. So, you know, that's one of the things that this is why historians are not popular at parties, because we pour cold water on them. But, you know, regardless of those, you know, those snipes, this was the most popular public service announcement in the history of television. People went absolutely nuts when this commercial came out. As I said, I was 11 years old, and my brother and I immediately ran out to the road next to our house and started picking up litter. And I still remember how angry we were at litter bugs for throwing garbage on the side of the road. So, you know, if you were a politician, it was just suicide to be opposed to anything related to protecting the environment in 1971, and that's why the Adirondack Park Agency passed fairly easily 50 years ago. And that is also another thing about 1971, before I move on with the story, is that it's important to point out, you know, as we're sitting here in an era when people don't really trust the government very much. But in 1971, they did. In 1971, this is a line chart from 1958 to the present day, showing the number of people who agree that the federal government will do the right thing always or most of the time. Okay, 1958, and see, we get into Vietnam, it starts going down. 1971 is right here. It's still a plurality of the population agrees with that statement. And then we get into Watergate, and it just goes off the cliff, and it never recovers. But 50 years ago, a majority of Americans still thought that if there was a complex social problem and the government recommended a solution for it, that was probably going to be okay, and you should support it. So that's how 28-year-old George Davis found himself alone in a big building in Raybrook that the DEC had recently abandoned and was planning to burn down before the Adirondack Park Agency was passed into law. In September 1971, George Davis was the first employee of the Adirondack Park Agency, and for several weeks, he was the Adirondack Park Agency's only employee. He famously tells a story, some of you have already heard, about his first day at work. The DEC's new building was next door in Raybrook. He got the key from the guy over there, and he went into the log cabin. There was nobody in there, there was no furniture, there was nothing. He felt really strongly that he had to get started, so he went back to the DEC guy and he found out that you could use something called, he'd never been a state employee before. He found out that you could use something called a purchase order to go into town and buy stuff. You just gave him the purchase order and they gave you the stuff. So he went in, he got a purchase order and he went into Saranac Lake and he bought 2 enormous cartons of toilet paper. And he came back to Raybrook and he put them down, and one of the cartons was his desk and one of the cartons was his chair. And he said it was that way for several weeks as he tried to get the APA started. This is the staff 7 months later, in April 1972. You can see there's George Davis. You see this man who he lured out of retirement because nobody knew as much as Clarence Petty. And Clarence found out that he was bored with retirement. So he came back to the APA I believe that this is Gary Randorf, who he had just hired. And this was the totality of the Adirondack Park Agency in April 1972. The plan was due in about 6 months, and it was for all of this territory. And they had to collect a ton of data, and then they had to go out into the field and make sure that all the data was accurate. And they didn't have very much time. And they didn't have very much money either. They also didn't have very much supervision. They were, 165 miles from the state capital. George told me that, George and several others confirmed that there was a refrigerator in the back of the APA building, and it was full of beer. And that the beer was really important to the operation of the agency. If you came back from field work in the afternoon, you could have a beer. If you were taking a cigarette break, you could have a beer. If you were there evenings and weekends, you could have a beer at your desk. These were state employees, and it was different. It was really a little bit more like a tech startup than a state agency. It was severely underfunded for reasons that are I won't get into now. But they didn't have nearly enough money. They didn't have any time, and they asked Governor Rockefeller for more time. They asked him for another year, and Rockefeller refused to give them more time. He said, either you turn this in March 1973, you turn in this plan to the legislature in March 1973, or there's going to be no plan. That's when things got really crazy. And George remembers, George and several other employees remember all-nighters. They remember, it takes 2 hours to drive from one part of the park to other parts of the park, and Raybrook is not in the middle of the park. A lot of late nights on the road with really bad quality state cars. A very, very tough sort of slog to make this deadline. And frankly, a lot of corners were cut in making this plan. A lot of bugs were not worked out when they had to turn the plan in to the commissioners to vote on in late October. So they. But they did. They submitted the plan to the APA board, the 9 members of the APA board, in late October 1972, because it had to be released for public comment before it could go to and revised, but based on public comment before it could go to the legislature. This is the board that they submitted it to. You'll notice once again, Peter Payne, always in the room. This is the chairman, Richard Lawrence, Governor Rockefeller, of course. Really, Henry Diamond from the Temporary Study Commission is also an APA commissioner. This is a fascinating character who really hasn't gotten enough credit. It's Mary Prime, who was a philanthropist in Lake Placid and the only woman on the board. The final vote was to send it on to the governor was 7-2 in favor of the plan. And I want to talk a little bit about the two guys who voted no. This is Bill Foley. Bill Foley was the town lawyer for Old Forge. Now, Old Forge, Bill's son Tim told me recently, Old Forge used to be just deader than a doornail in the winter until snowmobiles. And then Old Forge became a center for snowmobiles. And Old Forge became a year-round activity and a year-round economy because of snowmobiles. Well, the Forever Wild people really didn't like snowmobiles because they didn't feel that they should have unimpeded access to every part of the forest preserve. They were loud, they were smelly. Wasn't the vision of the Adirondacks that they had in mind. And so things got off to on a bad foot with Bill Foley, who really thought that snowmobiles were the savior of the town, and that the town was really the only thing that Bill Foley cared about. So things kind of went downhill from there. The other guy who voted no is Jim Bird. Jim Bird was a contractor and a resort owner in Racket Lake. And Jim Bird was the only APA commissioner who had ever actually erected a building inside the Adirondack Park. And he was supportive of the concept of protecting open space because, after all, the people who came to his little hunters colony depended on open space. That was why they came. He knew that. He thought it was a good idea to protect open space. But he was really bothered by the idea that it was so rushed and that local people hadn't been consulted. He kept pointing out all of these things that these young Turks who were driven by this new vision of environmental, data-driven environmental decision-making, had neglected, like the construction season in the Adirondacks is only about 90 days long. So, or was in 1971. So he in the end voted no, even though he supported the idea, he felt that it was full of holes. But 72, at the end of December, they released the plan for public comment 3 days before Christmas. And this is a repeat of the slide at the beginning of the show. I'm not going to go into detail about what the private land plan says, but basically there are 3 or 4 categories in the forest preserve. Wilderness and wild forest are 2 of the lighter shades of green here. And then there are 6 categories of private land. And the 2 that are most restrictive are the dark green, which is resource management, which is 1 building for every 43 acres. And then the orange, which is rural use, which is 1 building for every 8.5 acres, I believe. And the important thing to know about this map, the one important thing that sort of drove the story, is that 85% of the private land in the Adirondacks was ranked either resource management or rural use. The idea of the plan was to channel development and contain development near the areas like Saranac Lake and Lake Placid, where development was already there, to prevent sprawl out of those areas and to make those areas dense and to preserve the wilderness. So Tom DeLay, for example, that architectural drawing I showed you, he would have gotten about 1/8 as many units under this plan as he originally wanted to make his numbers work. He would have gotten 1/8 as many units as he needed to make his numbers work. And that's why Tom DeLay was never built. So, and Jim Bird was quite right. Thanks to Rockefeller's ultimatum, the process was terribly rushed. And the APA didn't really tell the local residents of the Adirondacks very much, if anything, about what they were up to. When they released the plan 3 days before Christmas 1972, and then said there was going to be 2 weeks of public hearings in the park in January, it was kind of like throwing a lit match into a bottle of gasoline. This is the rally in Saranac Lake on January 23rd, 1973. 800 people showed up, and the police thought that they were going to have a riot. Richard Lawrence, the park chair here at the podium, stood there for 8 hours and sort of took it as people just yelled and screamed at him. He tried as hard as he could to keep the lid on the hall. He did keep the lid on the hall. He got through the hearing. And he wasn't really all that bothered by them, actually, even though he was being screamed at for 8 hours by local people in the Adirondacks, because the local people in the Adirondacks weren't the people that Richard Lawrence needed to convince. Everybody he needed to convince lived in Albany. The public comment was something that Richard Lawrence needed to get through in order to get revisions into the plan to submit it to the legislature. So, the private land plan was signed into law in May 1973 because the environmental movement was still at its apogee, and it was, and Rockefeller really wanted it. And in May 1973, when Rockefeller really wanted something, the legislature almost always gave it to him. So that's where my book ends, with the signing of the private land plan. But it's far from the end of the story, because the tide started to turn against the APA almost as soon as Rockefeller signed the law. 3 months after he signed the law, Rockefeller told his staff that he was going to resign to make his 4th run for president. So the APA's most powerful defender left the baby while it was still in its crib. And it's clear in retrospect that the APA weakened itself by not paying enough attention to local residents and local concerns, and by rushing the process. People say that there was no alternative but to rush the process, but it's also true that people on the environmental side in the early 70s were pretty disdainful toward people who disagreed with them or brought up alternative points of view. And that made the opposition to the APA really entrenched, and they were quite determined, they were quite energetic, and they were quite creative. This is, you might have seen this around town if you've been around the Adirondacks for a while. This is a trucker cap that the opponents put together that says "Screw the APA." That was a popular item. It's now in the collection of the Adirondack Museum, but every once in a while you still see them. So what happened, because of this opposition, it was always in the minority, but it caused the state to spend decades playing defense and trying to patch up relationships with towns and local governments instead of maintaining a vision for the park. In 1977, a Saranac Lake man, a friend who still lives in Saranac Lake, Jim Hotelling, he was brought in to kind of, he's a professional planner, and he was brought in to sort of work with town and local governments to see what can be done. And he said that his motive of operation was to begin by asking people in the local towns and villages what they wanted. What was their vision for the town? What did they want it to be, and what were they afraid of? And once that he knew what their dreams and visions were, he had things that he could hang onto the plan that he wanted to advance, so that it created a greater chance of them working together. And then Hotelling sort of characterized the weakness of the original plan with a really memorable phrase. He said that it was all brains and no heart. I thought that was really, really apt. So again, drawing to a close here, the APA probably could not happen today in the way it happened in 1971, because public trust in elected officials is really about 20% now, and it really doesn't show very much sign of heading up anytime soon. But amazingly, the private land plan has still survived. It's still the law, and there have been really relatively few changes to it. And this is because the APA is entirely a creation of the governor. The governor appoints all of the commissioners, he controls the budget, and every governor since Nelson Rockefeller, regardless of how he or now she feels about the Adirondacks personally, is kept in line by a very well-organized and very well-funded environmental movement that yells and screams like crazy whenever a threat to the Adirondacks is announced. So it's support from voters statewide that has kept the APA alive for 50 years. And then, my final point is I have to say that despite all of the criticism of the APA that I've relayed here, it really was an amazing accomplishment. And the original wild idea, which is preserving the natural integrity of entire bioregions, that is more important now than it has ever been before. Because responding effectively to climate change means doing landscape level conservation work like the APA did on a global scale. In a way, the entire planet is now where the Adirondacks were in 1967. And the challenges that are facing the Adirondack Park are beyond the ability of the APA or even the state of New York to fix. So was this a one-off? Was the APA a one-off? Yes and no. It couldn't happen again in the same way, and it certainly could have done better. But it was a globally important advance in land use protection. And one day we might even look back on the APA as the beginning of a new era, because climate change gives us a compelling reason to act to protect entire bioregions. And that means preserving communities as well as nature. What the Adirondack Park plan was trying to do, it's important to point out, is extremely difficult. It was trying to find a way for people and nature to coexist, and now we need to do that on a planetary scale. I'll just end by saying we're never going to succeed at that job if the plans that we come up with are all brains and no heart. So now I'm going to play a teaser, a preview of the documentary that's going to air on Mountain Lake PBS on October 25th. And then I'll be happy to take questions for as long as you have them.
New York's Adirondack Park is bigger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, Grand Canyon, and Great Smokies National Parks combined. It is one of the largest unbroken deciduous forests on Earth, It has 1,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers and hundreds of crystal clear lakes and lofty peaks. But here's an even more amazing thing about the Adirondack Park. Most of its land is privately owned. And 85 million people live within a day's drive. Yet the Adirondacks seem almost completely undeveloped. How did that happen?
In the story of land use planning in the United States, the Adirondack Park Agency was truly significant. What it was doing at that time, it was on the frontier of land use planning.
The Adirondack Park Agency was a wild idea when it was created 50 years ago. It owes its existence to several big trends that combined to create an irresistible force. After World War II, a small group of activists spent more than 2 decades building the case that the Adirondacks needed to be protected from development. By 1968, they had overwhelming public support. The activists pressured Governor Nelson Rockefeller to act. Rocky set up a commission that studied the Adirondacks for 2 years before issuing 181 recommendations that were, in a word, bold. Many of them had never been tried before, and despite the risks, Rockefeller eagerly supported the activists' cause.
You know, he believed in big things. He was not a small man in any sense of the word. It wouldn't have happened without him. There's no question about it.
Rockefeller strong-armed state lawmakers into passing the bill that created the Adirondack Park Agency, or APA. He ordered the agency to write 2 master plans for all the land in the park, a territory the size of the state of Vermont, and to deliver them in less than 2 years. Nothing like that had ever been done before. The APA's young staff was brilliant, passionate about protecting the park, and extremely hardworking. The plans they produced were revolutionary, but they lacked 2 critical things: money and time.
We were given a very, very tight deadline and a very low budget. I mean, the budget was just ridiculous.
The APA also did not try very hard to explain its tough new regulations to local landowners, even though zoning laws had been almost entirely unknown in the Adirondacks. The activists were so focused on saving land, they didn't think about the 100,000 people who lived in the park, and many of those people were outraged.
I don't think it ever occurred to me or anyone that I was working with that maybe the local people might have a very different attitude about this plan to create a state agency. It just didn't occur to us at the time. Just didn't occur.
Over its first 50 years, the Adirondack Park Agency has been praised and studied as a triumph of land use planning. Today, the urgent need to control climate change depends on preserving and restoring large forests. New York did that in a big way 50 years ago. The wide open spaces of the Adirondacks are now recognized as a global treasure.
This is a big, wild area in a highly populated state where we have found a way to reasonably balance the protection of nature and the rights of people to live there. And I think the lessons from the Adirondacks are actually globally important.
But a lot of people who live inside the park disagree with this view. Even after 50 years, they still think the agency and its restrictions on private land development are un-American. They say private property is private, and the Adirondacks don't need more wilderness as much as it needs better jobs.
The agency has convinced people by repeating this untruth over and over again that this is the largest park in the United States. And they call all of the land inside of this Blue Ladder Park, which is not true. 60% of that land is privately owned. No privately owned land is part of a state park. In other words, they have taken the theory that Hitler practiced. If you tell a lie often enough, it will soon become believed, and it will be a fact.
It's an endless debate that boils down to a basic question. What is wildland worth?
I'm not seeing with your rifles, then they better have another thought about this. Because we are deadly serious about defending our rights over here.
Thanks.